So why are we here? What is this event? So what we're going to do is hold a question time style debate on the controversial subject of fracking, and which is of course the process by which natural gas is extracted from shale rocks. Let me briefly explain, ever so briefly, because we're going to get into detail, what that means. It would appear, ladies and gentlemen, that we're living our lives in a basin. We're living in the Bowland Basin, in fact, and that's an area that spans the country. And in the north, it starts at about Ripon, and it goes south as far as about Derby or Nottingham. And beneath our feet, about 2 or 3 kilometres beneath our feet, in fact, are shale rocks containing natural gas. And in fact, there is a good chance, and it is only a chance, because right now we really don't have any firm or convincing figures. We've got an indication, but there's a great deal of uncertainty. Nevertheless, there is a chance that down beneath our feet is enough gas that can be extracted to supply the UK at our current rate of consumption for 50 years or more, which is quite a lot. However, getting shale gas out of the ground is not easy. We normally go after gas in porous, sponge-like rocks, like sandstones. And getting gas out of those kind of rocks is relatively easy. You drill a hole into the sandstone, and the gas comes out under its naturally under its own pressure. If you drill a hole into shale rocks, a little bit of gas comes out, but not much, because it's not sponge-like, it's very dense, and so you have to stimulate it. And what that involves is drilling horizontally. In fact, if you watch the video that was on the screen, you'll have seen it. It involves drilling horizontally into the shale. Then you have to set off a series of small explosions underground, which fracture or perforate the pipe that you've installed and initiate some small cracks in the rocks. Then you pump in water and some additives. The additives are sand and some chemicals at high pressure, and what they do is open the cracks, cause them to grow, and then prop them open. And at that point, the gas will start to flow. And for reasons that we'll come to, the process is quite controversial. Test drilling sites such as the one at Bolcombe in Sussex have been beset with protests. And beset is actually, it turns out, and this was news to me today, I found out, beset is actually a legal term. You can be charged with besetting. It's actually a crime. And somebody was at Bolcombe. In fact, the daughter of Chrissie Hynde, who was the lead singer of the Pretenders, and Ray Davies, who was in the Kinks, both of whom have graced that stage right there. Their daughter, Natalie, was recently arrested, charged and convicted with besetting. And what she did was she superglued herself to another protester and a gate or something like that at the Bolcombe site. Now, it might reasonably be the case that there is a time for protest, but equally there's a time for reasoned debate and for airing all views, and I'd like to think you will agree with me that an event such as this evening is one of those. Therefore, I would urge you to let's raise any issue that you want to raise. There's nothing that's off the table. We can talk about any issue associated with fracking. But equally, let's make sure that all views are listened to with respect. And despite the strength of your feelings, can I urge you all, please, to resist the urge to superglue yourselves to anything or anybody, if you can possibly manage it. Okay, with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for me to introduce the panel and then to get on with the show. So, we have a very distinguished panel, and on the left-hand side of the panel is Dr. John Blamires. John is the Chief Operating Officer of iGas Energy. Now, iGas Energy is a leading British oil and gas explorer and developer, producing approximately 3,000 barrels worth of oil and gas a day from over 300 onshore sites across the country. I just want to emphasise the point. 100 onshore oil and gas wells operating in the UK now, producing 3,000 barrels of oil a year. He has 29 years experience in international experience in oil and gas with the Hess Corporation and with Shell International, and we're also pleased to be able to tell you that John is a graduate of Leeds University, has a BSc and a PhD in mining engineering. The next on the list is Andrew Cooper. Andrew is a member of Kirklees Council and was responsible for housing on the Cabinet for 3 years. I think either during that time or more recently, perhaps, the Council has instigated a solar programme to provide solar energy for 2,000 council houses in the area. He's also responsible for a project that will see many, if not every home in Kirklees insulated over the next 3 years. Andrew is the Green Party spokesman on energy and environment, and his energy efficiency credentials are such that I understand within the Green Party he's known as Mr. Insulation.
Yeah.
And he will be the Green Party candidate for Yorkshire and Humberside in the European elections in May 2014. Next is Professor John Barrett. John is Professor of Sustainable Research in the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds. His research interests include sustainable consumption and production modelling, carbon accounting, and exploring the transition to a low-carbon pathway. Techniques that John has developed are now used by numerous government departments to understand consumer emissions in the UK, as well as the carbon emissions embedded in products. John's a regular contributor to energy debates, and is often to be heard in the media on Radio 4, for example. Our fourth panellist is Simon Bowens. Simon is Friends of the Earth regional campaigner for Yorkshire and Humber and the North East. He's worked for the organisation since 2004. Now, Friends of the Earth believe that there should be a moratorium on shale gas exploration and drilling in the UK, similar to those already in place in France, Germany and several US states, until much more is known about its impact on human health and the environment. Simon was recently, as I understand it, the author of a review of drilling licences issued in the north of England entitled Fracking in the Desolate North, which I think is a reference to what I think we can agree was a fairly ill-judged remark by Lord Howell, the father-in-law of the Chancellor in the House of Lords. Our final panellist is Dr. Liam Herringshaw. Dr. Herringshaw is working as a postdoctoral research assistant at the University of Durham, where he is a member of the Unconventional Hydrocarbons Research Group. He's studying biogenic controls of variability in shale gas intervals. Liam is a paleontologist with a BSc in geology and physical geography from the University of Liverpool, and a PhD in paleobiology from the University of Birmingham. And in addition to this exemplary track record, he was also a terrifically successful contestant on the TV game show Countdown. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the panel. So, on with the show. So basically this is, so it's a question time type event. So we have a series of questions which are intended to really frame the themes for discussion. So I'll ask the panelists to respond to the question, but once they've done that, please feel free to ask any questions that you've got. Might be a good idea to keep the questions, if you can, in line with the themes of the posed question, because of course we're going to cover a number of subjects as we go through the evening. That said, if at the end of our sort of pre-posed questions there are some issues that we haven't covered and you want to discuss those, by all means ask questions about them. So, on with the show. The first question is from Andy Bray, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Earth and Environment and is somewhere over there, and hopefully he's got a microphone.
Hiya, thank you. So, following the planned closure of a number of oil and coal-fired power stations in the next few years in the UK, it's likely that we're going to be left with an energy deficit in terms of production. Is shale gas the most effective option for plugging this gap in both the short and the long term?
John, I thought we'd start on the left and then John, would you?
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's nice to be back here. 2 points to make. One, the refectory never looked like this when I was here. And two, I have the slightly dubious pleasure of having seen the Kinks live on that platform. So I vaguely remember it. It was in the 70s, so you'll understand why I vaguely remember it. Anyway, moving on to the question. I think this really gets to the heart of a far broader issue than shale gas per se. This really revolves around having an energy policy within the country around which we can look at what the way forward is for energy. And my starting point on that is we need to look at all forms of energy. We need to have a mixed energy mix in terms of the energy policy. The reason for the closure of the coal-fired power stations is primarily because of EU carbon emission requirements and meeting our commitments to that. The issue then becomes what replaces that? When we switch those off, we need to have the energy that was coming from there. And unfortunately, there isn't an obvious replacement for that. That's why we're already starting to talk about only having about a 4% reserve in terms of our energy supply, and the danger of the lights getting turned out, which of course has been somewhat exacerbated by the issues going on in Crimea and Ukraine. So coming back to the key issue is we need a mixture of energies. We need renewables, but they are nowhere near capable of replacing coal from our energy mix. We need nuclear, but that takes years and years to get approval for it and to actually implement it. And the one that's just been approved, I think it's about at least 5 or 6 years before that comes on stream. So these coal-fired stations are getting closed in the next year to 18 months. So the only real alternative out there in the short term is actually relying on imported gas. And that's why shale is not the ultimate answer to all of the energy issues, but is part of the mix, along with renewables, nuclear, hydroelectric, whatever it is. So that's my position on that one.
John, I wondered if you might like to comment on that one.
I would add that a future energy mix has to, more than anything, meet global carbon targets. I was always slightly amazed at the way when you go to sort of an oil and gas conference and then you go to a climate change conference, often the gap that exists between those two worlds. And if we were serious about avoiding a 2-degree rise, then any fossil fuel is clearly only part of a very quick transition. So therefore, I would argue that we do need an energy mix, but an energy mix is actually consistent with avoiding the incredibly dangerous consequences of runaway climate change. Added to that, I always feel there's a blind acceptance of the level of future energy demand. I don't think we've ever truly explored what it means to live in a society that has an annual reduction in the amount of energy that it needs. And lots of the analysis shows from an economic perspective that this is actually one of the cheapest forms of, or cheapest ways to actually achieve climate change mitigation. So to me, there are options on the table which could help answer the question of I suppose, long-term energy requirements, ones which are faced and look more at demand. So that is where I would like to see more focus. I recognise in the medium term that there is a need for certain fossil fuels for the transition, and if we are going to do that, then it has to be the lower carbon-emitting fossil fuels, such as gas. But that, to me, is a different question from whether we have gas or shale gas, which I'm sure we'll come to.
Thank you. Simon.
I think this John is absolutely right. Not necessarily that John over there. To look at the supply side of energy, when you're looking at energy security, is only looking at half the problem. If you look at the demand side, and start really investing in energy efficiency in this country, then you will get over the energy security problem. Another issue is that actually in the short term, if you look at the reports from Ofgem and from National Grid, the real energy crunch in terms of security is going to come around about 2016, 2017. Shale gas industry, at their best estimates, even if they kind of get a fair wind and everything else, are not likely to be anywhere near production until about 2019, 2020. So that we're not going to get over that lump by shale gas. What we are going to do on the supply side is we can start investing in renewables, which will get us over that lump, but only if the government gives clear policy framework for the renewables industry to invest. They're not giving that at the moment, and therefore you're getting a lot of offshore wind projects being pulled, a lot of the supply chain projects such as the Greenport Hull being put on tenterhooks for the moment, waiting for people like Siemens to actually have that clarity to be able to invest. So then we can start addressing the supply side. We've also got potential massive solutions around smart grid, grid balancing, interconnection with Europe, so we're spreading the risk, spreading the demand. And so that's the most effective, to answer your question, that's the most effective way of providing energy security. Not shale gas. We don't know how much we're going to get out of shale gas. Estimates are very variable. So for the government and industry to pin their hopes on actually shale gas addressing that problem, it's really playing a hostage fortune on that one.
Okay, Andrew?
Well, this is really looking at energy, in my terms, the question, through the wrong end of the telescope. If we're saying, how are we going to plug the gap? Like Simon was saying, it's really about how do we address demand and how do we reduce demand. If we look at what the government is actually doing, you may remember just a few months ago there was the comments about green crap on our energy bills, and this was about taking away the energy company obligation funding, which would equate to a bill saving of about £50 a year. Now, as a result of that money being taken off energy bills, there has been huge cuts in insulation grants right the way across the UK. And so, particularly in many homes of very poorly insulated homes, those funds have been cut, and lots of people on fuel poverty and low incomes have lost insulation. So that's the background in terms of demand. And of course, the funding for the energy company obligation was not that great in any case. It was just over about £1 billion a year, which sounds like a lot, but in terms of the job that needs doing, quite small fry. If we had a huge insulation programme that was to address all the lofts, all the cavities, all the attics, all the floors, all those sort of areas, if we were to have passive house design for new build properties as mandatory, we would reduce energy demand hugely, and it would make our choices in the energy field that much greater. And so we really are looking at this through the wrong end of the telescope if we're thinking that we're simply going to predict and provide shale. So no, shale is not the answer. Energy efficiency is a lot of the answer.
I just want to come back to you on that, if you don't mind. I mean, the question implies what can we do to plug the gap in the short and the long term. And Simon, you mentioned that the time required to go for shale, even if we do go for shale. But I wonder, can we do enough in the, so the Ofgem's predicted capacity crunch, if you want to call it that, the drop in capacity margin, which is actually predicted, as far as I understand it, to get to 2% in winter 15-16. Can we do anything on the efficiency front, do you think, in those kind of timescales?
By 2015?
Yeah.
Well, 2015 is quite
Soon,
clear,
yeah.
but shale gas certainly won't do that. It certainly won't. But the energy efficiency industry can ramp up quite quickly. I mean, a lot of this it's skilled work, some of it, but it's work that can be that can be learned quite quickly. And I think the energy sector, the energy efficiency sector, could ramp up within a few years to address that.
Liam?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really only able to speak safely on a sort of geological perspective in terms of the shale itself. And I think there is a lot of uncertainty about the prospectivity for shale in the UK, so that the idea, is it the most effective solution? Difficult to really say. And as we touched upon, the speed at which that shale gas that may be there can be tapped into is unclear. We don't really have a major onshore drilling program, and so the speed at which these things can be tapped into in say, the US is rather different to how it could be done here. And there is still a lot of uncertainty of the figures that we've seen about how much gas there might be. I mean, I will keep coming back to things from a geological perspective, but shale is an extraordinarily common rock type. It is basically mudstone, and an awful lot of mudstone does not have gas in it. And I think people have been perhaps slightly confused into thinking that because we've got a lot of shale, means there's a lot of shale gas, and that's not necessarily true. And because we don't have haven't had a big onshore drilling program in the UK, because most of our oil and gas has been extracted from the North Sea, an offshore program, there is a lot of uncertainty about how much gas there really is in there. Now, to clarify that would require drilling, and of course that would take time. So, I mean, the speed by which any gas that is in there could be extracted is likely to take many years. But on the other side, there is still the point you have to look at and say, well, if we are becoming increasingly dependent on coal, for example, in the US, shale gas has become such a boom that now we're importing a lot more cheap US coal. Is it better that we are looking at local fossil fuels that are cleaner than looking at relying on imported coal to run the existing power stations? I don't have the answer to say. I mean, I'm really coming at this from a geological perspective, but I do think there's a lot of uncertainty about. I can see certain regions of the UK having considerable shale gas potential, but a lot of it is really not that clear. So I think making a kind of a long-term decision that it's definitely a good thing is difficult to do. Okay,
I mean, I wanted to sort of put that one to the audience. I mean, the question is implying, what do we do in the short and the long term? And the short term is potentially really quite short. And one of the things, if you look at the Ofgem report, what you see is that what they think is going to start building capacity margin. So capacity margin basically means how much do we demand, how much can we generate when we're running flat out, and is there a difference between the two? And you'd like to think that the supply is bigger than the demand. And there is predicted to be a reduction in that margin 2015-16 in that winter, down to about 2%. But then it picks up. But the prediction is it picks up because we build more wind turbines. It's not, the prediction is not that we build capacity by going for shale. Now, I must admit, I was interviewed very recently on local radio about wind turbines and got a rather hard time because people don't seem to like wind turbines either. So, would anybody care to comment on what you think we should do? Are you happy that we go after shale in this part of the country, or do you think we should do something else to fill the generation gap, if there is one? So there's a point here, and then there's going to be was another one here, just some here, just here.
Thanks. It was just on the point of timescales and whether or not any sort of supply side measures in terms of building a new plant would really be sufficient with the time that we have in terms of the crunch on the capacity margin. And I agree entirely with the suggestion that energy efficiency and demand reduction is the only thing that can be done on the timescale that we have for that. In terms of the eco being cut to half the deployment rate, it was that. You've got to remember one of the other big goals the government supposedly over the last few years has been reducing the unemployment rate, which is quite high. The construction industry had a drop of about 400,000 jobs over the course of the recession, far worse hit than most of the other industries, and many of those people remain unemployed. A large part of that is because of having the rate of eco. If you wanted to get people back into work and be doing something that would be reducing bills and tackling this problem, I can't see any better option. That's an incredibly good way of tackling three of their core goals at once.
I think a point, something you didn't say, but you might have said there, is that actually when it comes to insulating houses, that's something that we can do with UK-based businesses. Can't build power stations with UK-based businesses, but that's my point. So perhaps I shouldn't put words in your mouth. There's a question here, or a comment here, just on.
Yes, I'd just like to ask, where does burning cleaner coal come into the equation? I did read somewhere recently that there's talk about reopening some coal seams and combining this with the clean coal burning technologies and flue gas desulfurization and trapping carbon dioxide in seabeds and all this sort of thing. Where does this part of the future development of energy production come into this, in your view, into this mix? And is it practical?
Anybody care to take that?
I'd happily add to it that clean coal in itself, I think it's a bit of an oxymoron. I think the only clean coal is potentially one which potentially could be linked to carbon capture and storage. That technology is many, many years away. We still do not have a large-scale demonstration plant in the UK. We would, if we really push that technology, we'd be lucky for it to be in place in the next 15 years. The problem is the electricity sector needs to reach a CO2 level of 50 grams per kilowatt hour by 2030. Coal is currently around 900, gas comes in around 400 when you burn it for electricity. So you clearly see that without that technology, we would struggle to meet those carbon targets. So in essence, I think that's an option which we shouldn't really consider.
John, did you?
Well, I was just going to add a couple of things, and I completely agree with John in terms of the fallacy about clean coal per se. What we're talking about is how do we generate energy for our homes, for heating, etc., in the short term, before we ever get into some world where maybe there are renewables and etc., picking up the slack. We are having to import, what's happening at the moment, because of shale gas in the US has stopped burning coal. What we've seen there is the CO2 emissions in the US have come down quite dramatically as a consequence of burning gas versus coal. As John just said, it's about a halving of the CO2 emissions. The irony of that is the US never signed up to the Kyoto Protocol. Europe did, and Europe's CO2 emissions are going up at the moment because they're importing the cheaper coal from the US, because coal from the US is cheaper than buying gas here in Europe. And so we're burning more coal. And then you've got to marry in the fact that we've got this stated aim of meeting our carbon commitments, which means shutting down coal-fired power stations. This is Yorkshire. We're sitting on top of coal seams. Unfortunately, the cost of extracting those coal seams is prohibitive by comparison with importing coal or importing gas. So we're faced with an ever-increasing importing energy from other parties outside the UK in the absence of having something that can actually generate energy here today. And so that's why I'm not advocating, it's not a shale gas or something else. Shale gas has the potential to offer us an indigenous resource that will help, and as John used the word, transition from where we are today to a world in which we wish to get to, but we're not going to be able to do it in one step. We have to find a route through that conundrum.
Sorry. Shale gas isn't available today, and it won't be available for quite a long time. So, and we're not in the same place as the United States were in terms of what we're burning. So the carbon savings that we can make are not the same. We're not starting from the same place. And I hope you're not suggesting that we can make the same sort of carbon savings as the US with shale gas, are you?
Well, I'm suggesting at the moment we burn about 40% of our energy comes from burning coal. And if we can remove that from the equation, you will reduce the CO2 emissions, which is a start towards the climate challenges. We're not going to get there in one step. It's unrealistic. I mean, just looking at the cost of energy, being controversial for a second, I mean, the cost of renewables is double, almost triple the cost of burning coal. So coal is by far and away the cheapest way. So we've all got a challenge for ourselves. We all want we want to address climate change. We want to reduce CO2 emissions. However, if we want to do it through the route of purely the renewables, etc., we've also got to accept we're going to have to pay considerably more for the benefit. And even if we insulate and do all of that, it's still going to cost a heck of a lot more than it does now. So we've got a socio-economic challenge here as well as a technical one.
I guess the question is whether the true costs of all energy are being met. I mean, the cost of not actually putting renewables in, the cost of not decarbonising could ultimately be much greater.
I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is there's a transition and we've got to look at all of the elements.
Okay.
But it's a cost that we cannot afford not to pay. You mean all the analysis shows that if we leave it, it will get more and more expensive. And I had a meeting with the Green Investment Bank the other day who was suggesting a 200 billion shortfall in the funds needed to bring about the renewable energy system. And a few people gasp at the scale of that number. I think it's a tiny price to pay for avoiding the consequences of climate change. We just gave the banks about 3-4 times that amount. It is nothing for the cost of society to avoid the consequences. So for me, money is there to help us overcome major social problems. And so therefore I don't actually see it as a cost, I see it as a solution, I think. But I don't deny that it doesn't cost money, and it needs commitment for that, but it's a cost that we simply can't afford to not pay, in my opinion.
Yes.
Thank you.
And we do seem to be kind of getting trapped into this. I mean, John's helpfully kind of framed the debate as one form of fossil fuel against another. Actually, it doesn't need to be that way. We can get to a largely renewable energy system. I mean, Friends of the Earth has worked with Department for Energy and Climate Change using their modelling tools to generate an energy mix which looks around about 75% of our energy coming from renewables by the end of the next decade. We haven't even touched the potential for renewables in this country yet. When you look at you look at the league table for renewables, we're kind of in the relegation zone here. We've got Malta and Luxembourg below us. Sweden, according to the European Commission's recent renewable energy stats, are producing over 50% of their renewables in 2012. And yet we're miles behind. We haven't even started to tap that potential. And that potential will bring significant jobs, significant economic benefits. So places like Hull will become a world-leading centre for renewable energy. And yet we're going down the route of shale gas. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Can I just have one quick
please,
point?
Please do.
I've also been involved in some research in carbon capture and storage, and I think regardless of whether shale gas is something that you go with, if we are to continue burning fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, that CCS does have a potentially important role to play. And as we've touched upon, it's not something that is yet in existence in the UK, but the Norwegians have been doing it for 15 years, and the technology is not that far away for it to be out of the question. And there's, beneath the North Sea, enormous amounts of permeable, porous sandstone rock in which it could potentially be large quantities of CO2 could be stored. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you have to go into shale gas, but I think CCS is something we need to at least consider, because if you are carrying on burning coal or gas or whatever fossil fuels we're using for the foreseeable future, that then having something else to try and mitigate their impacts is potentially quite useful.
Yeah, I think for carbon capture and storage, coal is a wrong place to put it. I mean, one real kind of benefits of carbon capture and storage is using it in industrial plants, in industries like cement, steel manufacturing, glass manufacturing, where they are kind of trapped into a high carbon, high energy usage system. If you use it for them, because we are going to need those industries, even in a renewable system, we need cement, we need steel to be able to manufacture the wind turbines and the infrastructure to provide that future energy system. So let's put the money into researching into CCS for industrial applications rather than continuing perpetuating coal for generations to come.
Okay. I was interested, one of the suggestions that was made, and it was greeted with some support, was the idea that it doesn't matter, it would be acceptable to pay a bit more for our electricity if it was coming from renewable sources. In the best traditions of question time, I wondered if we could do a quick straw poll. So, I mean, who would be happy if your electricity was, let's say, quite a bit more expensive, but you knew that we were going for renewable sources of electricity? Who'd be comfortable with that and would happily pay? And who would not? Okay, right. These guys are up for it.
I think that's probably not totally representative, if I'm going to be honest.
Really? Go on.
No offence to anyone, but I think that we do have major problems in terms of distribution impacts, which we would have to address with increasing electricity prices.
Okay, there's a point here.
I think there's a significant issue, though, that at this on the table, we're talking about macroeconomics. I think it's important that we look at the culture within our own behaviours and the way that's encouraged. I mean, why do people walk around with hardly any clothes on in the middle of winter in their own homes? It's ridiculous. One reason is because we don't have any ownership of any funding that's made from, the energy. I mean, for example, you mentioned Sweden, but also in Denmark, people have their own shares in their local wind power. We aren't encouraged to do that. Yes, it may be if we put insulation in our loft, we begin to feel the benefits. But at the moment, I don't think the culture is strong enough for us to actually recognise that our own behaviour is quite important, because at the energy industry at the moment is dominated by large companies whose only ambition is to make more money for their shareholders, and those shareholders aren't us, aren't the common people, aren't the most of the time, and so we don't have a commitment, and there seems to be a need for a change in that. I think it's quite important, and that someone said in Denmark, if they knew that a wind machine that was in their field was actually producing money that was going into their pocket, actually it's quite a beautiful structure, and I think that's quite important.
Can I just come back on
please.
that? I mean, one of the things about Margaret Thatcher, whatever you think about her, I've got a few opinions. She was one of the things that she was about a property-owning democracy, about people owning their own homes and all those sort of things. And you can have various opinions about what you think about that. But it was very much a big idea on which lots of policies flowed from. And one of the things I think would be really good in terms of having a vision for energy going forward is having an energy generating democracy, where you've got more and more people are involved in generating their own heat, their own power, and where they have ownership of it, either on their own home or through cooperatives that own wind turbines or own solar farms or are involved in the production of sustainably sourced biomass for heat. These are the sort of things where people would actually have a stake in their own energy. They would not be divorced from it. They would have some sort of knowledge of that. They would care more about saving it because they were generating it. And when people have got a solar panel on their own home, they will then care more about the energy they use because they've got the chance of actually coming out on top in terms of by changing their behaviour. So getting an energy generating democracy in this country would be a way of us really moving forward and getting people to buy a stake into what renewables are all about.
Okay, thank you.
And just prime example of that is in Germany. In Germany's they have a system in Germany called Energiewende, which is basically, again, people owning their own power generation. So Germany are producing about 20% of their energy from renewables. Half of that is community owned, community ownership, and they're starting to actually own their energy grid, their distribution grid in Germany at the moment, in some communities. Somehow I can't see communities wanting to develop a community shale gas scheme in this country.
Okay, and on that, I think we need to move on to the next question. So the next question is from Irini Kirigiani, who's a postgraduate student here at the University of Leeds.
Thank you. Is it safe to pursue shale gas by hydraulic fracturing in a densely populated country like UK, given concerns about earthquakes, but mostly about water contamination?
Liam, I wondered if you might want to start with that one as a geologist.
One of the projects I'm involved with in Durham is called Refine, Researching Fracking in Europe, and the aim of that project is to look at these sort of questions of the genuine risks associated with shale gas production, and yeah, I mean clearly earthquakes and water contamination come out as two of the things that people have particular concern about. Colleagues of mine have carried out some research into this, and we're also carrying on further work into various areas along these lines. I think earthquakes are a little bit of a red herring in the sense that we have small earthquakes that have been associated with fracking in the UK. But if we look at induced seismicity, so man-made earthquakes across a wide variety of activities, the potential for shale gas production to cause significant earthquakes is pretty low. But I think in the UK, because we're not really a very seismically active country. We're a long way away from any regions where major seismicity takes place. We're a little sort of unsure quite what earthquakes mean, and so any kind of tremor can cause concerns. But of course, there are still concerns about if potentially you do have earth movements going on and that affects the wells themselves, then you could be looking at leakage pathways being created, which would then be a concern. So the earthquakes, in terms of what they would do to us at the surface, I don't think are a primary concern, but there are potential impacts that small amounts of seismicity could still have. Now, in terms of water contamination, people again, and I get a bit semantic here because as a geologist, when I think of hydraulic fracturing, I think, and then to talk about fracking, the process of hydraulic fracturing itself, not the entire thing. Some people say, can fracking cause contamination of aquifers? Again, research that guys within Refine have done indicates this is pretty unlikely because the depth at which you are fracking shales for gas is typically 2 or 3 kilometers below the surface, and your aquifers are a couple of 100 meters below the surface, and the distance that an artificial fracture can propagate upwards is, well, the largest recorded is 588 meters, and the research that colleagues have done has indicated there's a less than 1% chance of any fractures propagating upwards more than 350 meters. So as long as and we've suggested a minimum distance of 600 meters between the shale that you were targeting and your aquifer would hopefully reduce the possibility that any of the hydraulic fractures could provide a pathway from the target shale to the groundwater. But of course, all wells targeting the shales will go through an aquifer, and the well integrity is a much greater concern. Now, it could be linked into seismicity, but it could just be into the general upkeep and monitoring of the well. And we have a paper that's actually coming out next week that is sort of looking into this issue of well integrity, because we think that is more likely to be a potential sort of issue than earthquakes or the fracturing itself. And data, there's a lot, say in the UK we don't have a big onshore oil and gas industry, so there's not a lot of data that we can sort of easily interrogate from the UK, but obviously the fact that shale gas has been going on in the US, production has been going on in the US for a number of years, provides quite a lot of data sets, and it's clear that whichever data set you look at, a small percentage of wells have integrity issues at some point in their lifespan. Pennsylvania data set of wells studied between 2005 2013 indicates between 3 and 6% of shale gas wells have some form of barrier or integrity failure. Now, whether that is directly applicable to the UK for various reasons in terms of technology and the geology is difficult to say, but it's clear that from the existing data sets we've looked at that a small percentage of wells will have issues, so clearly that could then be a problem. And the whole aim of what Refine and colleagues are trying to do is to clarify what the issues really are, and I think sometimes the sort of the sensational aspects of something like an earthquake gets focused on when in fact there are probably other things that we should be paying attention more closely to.
Simon, have you?
I think, yeah, I mean, certainly with the earthquakes, I'd agree with Liam. I mean, the effects of those kind of levels of earthquakes that we saw at Priest Hall, which was the only UK high-pressure, slick water, horizontally drilled fracking that's gone on so far to date in the UK, that did produce an earthquake. It wasn't particularly felt at the surface, but it did damage the well at Priest Hall. So we need to be really kind of careful in terms of not being over alarmist about earthquakes, but if that creates a risk of leaking into the groundwater, then that's a risk we need to make sure we don't take. The groundwater directive in the EU is absolutely crystal clear that the groundwater should be preserved and any risk to groundwater should be removed at source. There are multiple risks around fracking, from groundwater contamination, potential surface water contamination. You're dealing with large quantities of sometimes hazardous materials, hydrochloric acid, etc. Spillages on that in those areas, in those rural areas, which in some of those rural areas you're looking at pristine farmland. You're also looking at major amounts of local transport and the air quality impacts of that, as well as the air quality impacts of flaring and venting from wells. You're also looking at potential risks to. I think the biggest risk of however, as John said, is actually if you invest heavily in shale gas, what happens to your climate targets? What happens to carbon emissions? They go rocketing through the roof to a level that the International Energy Agency has said a golden age for gas would lead to around about 3.5 degrees rise in global temperatures. That is absolutely unsustainable. We have never been there before. We don't want to go there because that would create havoc, disruption, chaos around the world. And I don't want to go there. I don't want to send my children there either.
Andrew?
Well, we talked a lot about risk here, and the way you deal with risk is regulation. And the Prime Minister, when he's been promoting fracking as an idea, has been saying that we're going to have one of the toughest regulation regimes in the world with fracking. And that's the aim of that, of course, is to reassure us that all the issues that have been raised, that Simon's raised, are going to be addressed, and that there won't be any problems, that we won't have any issues. There are a few causes for concern, however, in that when calls for tougher regulation were brought up in the European Parliament and defeated, that it was the UK Conservative MEPs who were actually opposing a tougher regulation for fracking. And when you look at there are fracking engineers who are actually very much in favour of fracking, but are concerned that that the government themselves are having such a lax and laissez-faire regime, according to in terms of their regulation on fracking. And so there are some real risks, but the regulation side of things appears to be quite lax, and there doesn't seem to be the commitment from government to actually put much pressure at all on the industry on standards.
Okay. John, is this one for you?
No, I think it's all been said.
Okay, so John, is it safe? Are you over-regulated, under-regulated?
A lot has been said. Let's try and put a few facts on the thing. First of all, the UK, along with Norway, has the global exemplar in terms of regulatory and permitting and so on. We have to have 9 permits before we can do anything. We have to conduct environmental impact assessments, environmental risk assessments, etc., etc. Simon mentioned the groundwater directive. That's something that we have to absolutely abide by. As I say, it is a world leading in terms of regulatory oversight, and very, very different from the US. I've worked in the US, so I know what goes on there. There are probably over a couple of million fracks done in the US. There's an enormous data set there. Let's get a couple of things out here. And picking up on Liam's point, if you take nothing away from this evening, take this one point away. The debate isn't really about fracking, quite frankly. The industry has come up with 2 words, 2 adjectives or nouns that are really very unfortunate. One was using the word unconventional for this, because there's no difference between shale gas and ordinary gas. The gas that comes out of your cooker is exactly the same as shale gas. There is no difference whatsoever between them. The other word that's very unfortunate is fracking, for any number of reasons, but it certainly helped the media make things a little bit more interesting. The thing I want you to take away from this evening is the debate is not about fracking. The debate is actually about ensuring that we as an industry drill and construct and design those wells with the proper well integrity. If we do that, then you remove essentially all of the key issues that you have concerns about. Liam said we haven't got a very large onshore industry. Well, the industry's been going, the first wells were drilled back in 1836 or thereabouts down in Sussex. But in terms of a modern industry, it's been going since about the Second World War. There are over 2,000 wells drilled, of which about 200 have been fracked without incident, safely, environmentally, responsibly. So we have a long history of doing this. What we've not been very good is going and shouting it from the rooftops and explaining that. It's, I do sort of get a little bit sort of upset when I hear about we're going to be responsible for boosting climate change. What we're talking about here is we import something in excess of 50% of our gas at the moment, and that will continue to rise. By 2020, it's predicted to be 70% of the gas that is burnt in the UK will have to be imported. What we're talking about is replacing that imported gas with gas that is developed from here within the UK that results in jobs, etc., for people in the UK. Put that into some perspective. The utility companies that provide you with gas, one of them has just bought £10 billion worth, £10 billion worth of shale gas from the US. So what we're doing at the moment is you're paying in order to buy shale gas from America. And what we're saying is that as part of the energy mix, not as an either or, but as part of it, shale gas has the potential to offset some of those imports, make sure that that money doesn't go out of the country, is reinvested here. I'd be all for some of that money going into the renewables industry and helping it move along. That, to my mind, makes a lot of sense. If I was the government, that's what I would certainly do. But developing our own gas at least will offset A, those imports, B, it'll create jobs, C, it'll sustain existing jobs. For instance, there are petrochemicals industries that produce the buttons on your shirts, the pieces of your iPads, etc., are reliant on gas for its raw feedstock. What's happening to those industries is that because of the high cost of gas here, it's cheaper for them to reshore to the US, because the cost of gas is a third of what it is here. So by developing onshore gas here, we've got the opportunity to sustain not just jobs within that industry, but other ones as well. And just to put something into perspective, to get this all into some perspective, we burn about 3 trillion cubic feet of gas per annum. The North Sea has 19 trillion cubic feet of recoverable gas left in it. So roughly the North Sea, if we took all of our gas, instead of importing it, we took it just from the UK sector of the North Sea, it's got 6 to 8 years worth of supply before it runs out. Now, hopefully we'll extend that, but that's the current state of play. Shale gas in the north of England, and Liam's right, there's uncertainty, but if you take the mid-case figure from the British Geological Survey, there is about 1,300 trillion cubic feet in the ground. If you assume a 10% recovery of that, that means you can recover about 130 TCF, which compared to the North Sea's 19 TCF, 130 is recoverable in the north of England today, which is about the 50 years that Andy spoke about earlier on. And the point about that is that is part of how we can transition from where we are today into the world in which we all want to get to. Can it be done safely? The answer to that is yes. We're not going to go fracking in very densely populated areas, but I can take you to sites where we have wells in the middle of housing estates, in areas of outstanding natural beauty, middle of golf courses, and where we can do this safely, environmentally responsibly, without incident.
Can I come back on that?
Yes, please.
They talk about jobs, but of course there's lots of choices. Jobs can be created in energy efficiency, jobs can be created in renewables, jobs can be created in the building industry in terms of passive housing. It is not an either or. There are jobs everywhere in terms of the choices that you actually make. And those choices, by actually making some of those choices, it means you don't necessarily have to make the choices of shale gas and such like. Those choices don't necessarily have to be made. It gives you more choices by actually investing in energy efficiency and lowering demand, which needs to be done. if we are going to be exploiting 50 years worth of shale gas, that's 50 years worth of emissions that are associated with that, and that's not really providing. That's taking away lots of choices from us in terms of our energy future.
I would offer that what it's doing, it's giving you options. First of all, one, for the country as a whole, for the nation as a whole, and secondly, and I too want to live on a planet that is clean, etc. Yes, I work in an industry that's producing fossil fuels. I do. However, it is so integral to all of our lives every day that it's almost fatuous to say we can't live without it at present. The point is, how do we get to a world that we all want to aspire to in a sensible way? And one of the difficulties is, and I appreciate the arguments, and I'm completely, it's all of these things, it's a mixture of all of them. But I also hear this thing whereby we alone are supposed to try and solve the whole climate problem. We've got to contribute to it, but the reality of life is that the rest of the world is burning fossil fuels at a vastly greater rate, and our impact on it is not such that we can be completely one-sided about it. We have to look at it in a much broader sense and recognise that whatever the UK does, and it has the most extreme carbon limits in terms of what we're prepared to do, and that's laudable that we're trying to set an example, but we've got to look at it in the broader economic size of things as well.
But we're in the bottom of the league for renewables. There's Malta and Luxembourg below us. In terms of our building standards for energy efficiency are being reduced. We are not the top of the league. We're way down at the bottom in Europe.
And I hear this, I hear Simon's comment about Hull becoming the centre for renewables. One of the issues that I think we've missed the boat, quite frankly. All the wind turbines that are out there are all built in Germany or in Scandinavia. The UK has lost that market. It is not going to come here. It's being done elsewhere. We are standing on the threshold, and I acknowledge you don't like shale gas. We're standing on the threshold of being the leader in terms of developing this in Europe and being able to bring industries associated with that. And the point I'm trying to make is that if we grab that opportunity, it is both beneficial for the balance of payments, it displaces coal from our energy mix, it moves us down the path of cleaner things, it provides jobs and economic support, and it provides a tax revenue that, if it's used sensibly, can help move us towards the renewable world. And that's where I'm coming from.
Well, but we may be the leaders in Europe. That's because places like France, Germany, various other places don't want to lead in this because they don't have any faith in it.
And partly because France is primarily invested in nuclear, point one, and Germany is burning brown coal at an enormous rate of knots and creating more and more brown coal power stations. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen brown coal works. What they do is they move through the countryside and remove villages, lift them up, replace them over here and carry on through. So you're talking about one of the most inefficient fuels of burning. So I acknowledge your desire, and I'm completely actually supportive of your arguments in terms of loft insulation and improving, and the lady over there that's talking about investment in heating and so on and so forth. But we've also got to look at the broader picture as well and say, how can we use this indigenous resource to move us to the world we wish to get to?
The difference is with Germany is that Germany have the Energiewende, which is a vision of where they want to get to. There are certainly things that are wrong in terms of lignite and the use of it in Germany at the moment, but at least they have a vision of where they're going to get to and how they are actually going to reduce their carbon emissions, which is very lacking in the UK.
We have a set of targets without a vision. Now that I would completely agree with.
Okay.
And on that, gents, let's put it to the audience. So, folks, if you go ahead with this.
I just want to pick up one thing that John said about the regulatory regime, and this is around the issue of environmental impact assessments. Yeah. The vote that Andrew was talking about in the European Parliament was concerned with whether the shale gas industry should have mandatory environmental impact assessments requirements. The Conservative MEPs decided to vote that down, and now that's So it's that kind of question.
But Simon, to be fair, the industry has adopted as a mandatory thing that we do environmental impact assessments and environmental risk assessments. That is mandatory. That's in our guidelines. You will not be allowed to go and do anything without it. So we've adopted that anyway as part and parcel of our own guidelines.
I think I would agree that actually the industry is almost 2 steps ahead of the government in terms of regulating or pushing for regulation. I think one of the key other things around employment is some real kind of key research that you need to know about, and that's basically that the renewables industry, for every dollar invested in the US, is actually producing 3 times as many jobs than the shale gas industry is. So when we're talking about jobs, it's not a quid pro quo here. It's a real kind of chance to invest in jobs which are going to last and reform and regenerate places like Hull and Teesside and Tyneside for generations to come.
Okay, thank you. Folks, so if this goes ahead, it's our homes that it's going to be done underneath. Do we feel safe? So there's a comment or a question here.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I just wanted to highlight a point that I don't think renewables is as great as everybody on the panel is talking about it to be. We've talked a lot about Germany and that kind of being an example land of how renewables is spearing the way. But we talked also, Simon, earlier about how you want to see manufacturing growing. Well, companies like BASF are wanting to pull out of their headquarters in Germany. Dow Chemical has seen profits go up massively in the last 3 years because they've gone to lands where they're going for cheaper energy costs. The same could happen in the UK if we drive purely only to renewables and don't look at things like shale as a cheaper resource which can help that manufacturing grow.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on the jobs thing. The fact that renewables produce 3 times as many jobs shows you how inefficient renewables are. Because the point of producing energy is to produce energy, not to produce jobs. The more labour you have involved, the more expensive any production is going to be. So the point is to produce energy, not jobs.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. John was quite correct in that the gas from fracking is the same as it's methane, CH4 as I understand it. However, there is a safety issue which I think is brushed over. Is is it just water that it gets pumped, or is the chemicals? And even if it is just water, there is still the danger that other elements will actually get into the water table.
Well,
which and also, I mean, there's the whole issue.
No, please.
Okay, let me. If you just bear with me 2 or 3 seconds, if I may, Mr. Chairman, explain what is fracking, so we all understand that, if this would help you. Andy spoke about conventional reservoirs are porous. They're like, if you think of the bath sponge you have, and the water soaks up into it, and it's got those pore spaces in it. Shale rock, you could pour water on it, and water won't go into the rock at all. It's what we call impermeable. It's what we also refer to it as being very tight. It won't allow anything out of it or into it. So in order to get the gas out of it, we have to fracture it by hydraulic means, which means pumping water down. So what we do is we pump water in, and it causes the rock to crack. And then that will allow the gas to flow out. However, as soon as you stop pumping, the rock closes again, and no gas will flow. So what we then do is we pump water with sand in it, so that when we crack the rock, sand particles go into that fracture. So when we stop pumping, it closes, but now it's got grains of sand in there, which gives you just enough permeability to allow the gas to flow out. However, if you imagine you're going down, and forgive me, in the oil and gas industry, we mix our units. I'm going to stick in feet. Hopefully we can all remember what feet were. We go down about 10,000 feet, and then we go horizontally along about, say, 10,000 feet along horizontally, and we want to fracture along that. And just so you understand what the scale of this is, that's an 8.5-inch hole we're drilling down 10,000 feet and along 10,000 feet horizontally. And we fracture the rock along that 10,000-foot horizontal section. But if you put sand and water down, what's going to happen to it? It's all going to fall at the bottom of the well and it won't go along there for 10,000 feet. So we add some chemicals to it. What are they? Well, the well in the Fylde that has been hydraulically fracked with slick water, as Simon refers to it, because he's going to pick me up when I tell you there are 200 fracks being done onshore. There's only one of shale that's been done. But that involved pumping water, sand, and they put one other chemical in there. It was polyacrylamide, which you'll find in soil. You use it in soil. It's a friction reducer, basically. And you use it for soil preparation, etc., in the garden. Some other chemicals that are used, the most common one is something called guar gum, which ladies, predominantly ladies, I'm sure, I don't want to be sexist in any way, but if you're wearing lipstick, then you'll have guar gum in your lipstick. Other chemicals sometimes that are used include the sort of fluids that you'll find in contact lens fluids or in toothpaste. If you go under your kitchen sink, you'll find some of the chemicals there. And why do we put the chemicals in? Well, what it does is it viscosifies the water so it can carry the sand along to where we want it and get it into those fractures. However, if you imagine you've now viscosified the water, it's like a gel carrying the sand. When we start pumping, what you've got is gel, sand, and no gas will flow out. So we have to put another set in called breakers that break up that gel, allows the water to flow back out, leaving the sand there and allowing the gas to flow. So there are some chemicals used, but they're fairly common. We will not get authority to use any unless they are deemed to be non-hazardous by the Environment Agency. So we have to disclose as part of our planning applications what chemicals are going to be used, what volumes, before we do anything, and that's part of the public consultation, the environmental impact assessment. And then we have to publish, so there's full transparency, which chemicals were used, and they're made available publicly so everybody can look at it and understand exactly what's being done. Coming to your point about aquifers, it goes back to the issues about well integrity. If you design the well properly, then you will preclude any impact in terms of the aquifers. The aquifers, as Liam said, are about 200 metres, 600 feet down. We're typically drilling somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 feet for the shale. So we do not design it, we can't frack from 10,000 feet up to 600 feet anyway. We don't have pumps large enough, we don't have enough money to do it. We can't do it technically. We can actually design our fracks so we know where they're going broadly and we can measure where they go, and that again information will be made available so that people can understand exactly what we're doing and we could be monitored. There are no, to the very best of my knowledge, out of the millions of fracks that have been done, there is no evidence that fracking has caused pollution of shallow aquifers. There is some evidence, and the report Liam's talking about will talk about it, but there is some evidence of wells that have been drilled in areas that have undergone hydraulic fracturing having pollution occur. In the US, there are occasions, and they are because the well wasn't constructed properly. It is not because of fracking. There is evidence as well that in the US, what they do, they dispose of you get flowback water. When you frack a well, you then flow the water back out, as I said. What they do in the US, they either put it into open pits and let the heat evaporate it off into the atmosphere, or they pump it back into the ground down what they call disposal wells. If you pump for long enough down a disposal well like that, you will cause two things to occur. You will potentially cause so-called induced seismic events, mini earthquakes, and secondly, you've got the danger, if you haven't constructed that disposal well properly, then you've got the potential of putting it into the shallow aquifers, and that's what has happened in the US. And the point about all of that is their level of regulation is nowhere near the same as ours. Let me also, because this is a balanced debate, let me say, none of this is without some element of risk. We'd be naive if we said we can be absolutely 100% absolutely guaranteed that there isn't some risk. That would be naive. But I can assure you there are other things that go on, which I don't really want to sort of get into because it's not fair for me to throw other industries and other types of activities under the bus. that are nowhere near as well regulated, that if certain members on this panel would be highly supportive of those industries, and they do something pretty much absolutely identical to what we do, but they don't have to go through any of the permitting that we have to do as an industry. So, to your point, I can't stand here or sit here and guarantee 100% every time that there isn't a risk, but the risk is pretty much infinitesimally small. And because of the regulatory authorities and because of what we are held to account to, I am very, very comfortable and confident we can do this safely and environmentally responsibly.
Okay, thanks. Before we just take another point from the audience, so just the point that was raised about the jobs chance. I mean, Jim Ratcliffe, the owner of INEOS, has gone on record in the last week or so saying that if energy prices stay the way they are, 6 million jobs in the chemicals industry could go in Europe. And I just wondered how that squares with the idea that we're going to create lots of jobs with the renewable energy industry.
Let's get one thing absolutely clear. Shale gas is not going to bring energy prices down in the UK. No. Shale gas at the moment is actually more. It's actually more of an expensive process to extract gas than conventional drilling is. Let's see who's actually said that shale gas will not bring prices down. Ed Davey has said that for a start. Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, leading the charge for being all out for shale. Lord Brown, who's the chair of Quadrilla, one of the drilling companies, has said that shale gas will not bring down energy prices. So let's not kid ourselves that we're suddenly going to get this massively cheaper energy prices. John has mentioned the chemicals which they're putting down. I was fortunate, I'm not sure this is the right word, but fortunate a couple of weeks ago to be looking at Rathlin Energy's exploratory drilling process into the Bowland Shale in East Yorkshire last week, looking at their environmental permit application. They're pumping something like 11,000 litres of hydrochloric acid solution into the ground. In the fracking industry, they will try to assure you that they'll get everything out. They'll only get about 20 to 80% of what they pump down there. They will manage to get out to the surface again. So 20 to 80% is going to stay underground. They're also going to be sucking things up from the surface, which will include benzene, toluene, strontium, naturally occurring radioactive materials, all of which puts extra pressure on wastewater treatment plants and in the economy, adding more cost to that. In terms of the jobs at Not Energy, to some extent, you can apply that principle to everything. If you're looking at the chemical industry is there to produce chemicals, not to create jobs. The steel industry, etc. So the kind of argument that you're putting forward, that actually just because the renewables industry creates more jobs is somehow seen as a weakness of that industry. I'd really like to kind of explore that with you and explore a lot of the kind of people who are saying, oh well, this and that will create thousands of jobs, because if we are wanting to build a fairer and more prosperous society, then people will need employment.
Okay, folks, I think we'll just take two more questions, too much comments from the audience on that particular point, and then we need to move on to the next question. There's a point in the audience here, actually.
What's the worst case potential toxicity impact, and what contingencies you've got in place to deal with it?
Okay, can we just hold that just for a sec? And then there's just one point here. Sorry, folks, we're sort of getting close to running out of time. But
I just wanted to say that 50 years really doesn't seem a very long time. That seems very kind of short-sighted to be just talking about 50 years. That's within my lifetime. That's within most, I would tell you guys on the panel's lifetime. It's kind of, and so this isn't it. If this is creating jobs, fracking, then those jobs might not be around in another 50 years. And we kind of, we've seen an industry where people were made unemployed when that industry collapsed in the coal industry, and the impact that had on people who lost those jobs. And also just, I don't know, the environmental impact of fracking in 50 years' time, not just now in the immediate time, but when those wells are left in the ground or when those chemicals have done whatever they do, it's kind of, it just seems a very, very short-sighted way of looking at things. You're not really building a whole industry of jobs if that industry is going to end in 50 years. And meanwhile, other countries have been invested in the renewable energy and might be light years ahead of us by then. And in fact, we've just got loads of people unemployed.
They are now.
John, do you want to comment on the...
Well, let me, if I can, I'll deal with yours first of all. 50 years. North Sea, when it started, typical recovery factors were probably assumed to be somewhere between 20 and 25%. Today, they're in north of 50%. So with advancing technology, etc., you can extend the life of this. So going to the 50 years, that makes an assumption of a 10% recovery. If we can move that to 20%, then it's 100 years. But let's come back to the broader thing, because you're still thinking in terms of one thing or another. Remember, this is about looking at the overall energy mix. This is not just shale gas or something. And it goes to the point John made about it being a transition fuel. It's a way of moving us from where we are today to getting to a point where, for Andy and Simon, their world will be, it's all wind and solar, etc. Okay, if we can get there in 50 years' time.
Can I add to this? Because I'm being...
all of those, I'm making the point that we're not there today. They can't pick the slack up. We have to rely on fossil fuels to do it. So whether it's 50 years, 100 years, it will actually disappear if there are better, more economic and viable and greener and cleaner solutions. And so it's a means of getting us there. So that's my point to that.
Can I?
Well, no. Yeah.
Norway did.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I add in, because I'm being quoted as a transition fuel. I think maybe our timescales of transition might be referring to a slightly different. If we were to meet climate targets, then we would virtually need no fossil fuels on the system by 2030. That's a kind of scale of transition that we're talking about. So if we're talking about 50, 100 years and extending these assets, I find that frightening, because the economic costs of climate change are almost uncalculable. And we seem to feel that we can manage those costs effectively and compare them with today's costs, and I find that unacceptable. And there is also the issue then that if we were going to do something about climate change, surely we'd have stranded assets in this sector. Surely we would have paid an absolute fortune for the infrastructure that we now can't use. So therefore, that would be that we're underestimating the economic costs of it at this time. And I suppose finally, I'd really like to make the point about the jobs issue as well, because I find labour productivity one of the bizarrest indicators of societal success. I cannot understand why we feel we've done something well for society by getting as much money for as little people working as possible. I find that bizarre. Bizarre to the extreme. I think we need to be a lot more sophisticated in the way. Yes, productivity. Yep, I'm not against productivity, but productivity which delivers goals for society. Productivity where no one is working. Productivity, well, there's actually major questions to suggest that productivity doesn't always deliver total goals for society. We actually find many indicators of social mobility do not actually climb with GDP growth. There are many indicators which show a very poor correlation between the two past certain stages of development. Yeah. And there's an enormous amount of research which backs that up. It is not rubbish at all. There is the academic literature which clearly shows that indicators in terms of life expectancy, in terms of mobility, in terms of health indexes, do not radically improve beyond a certain level of growth. And that's clear. There's international statistics on this, which are not difficult to look up and follow. It is no, don't shake your head, because it's not, it's true. I have academic...
It's okay.
No,
it's the old... No, it's the old man in the... No, it's the old man in the pub argument who feels you can suddenly argue against evidence. There is evidence for this.
Somebody's got to read the Daily Mail.
Okay, look, I think...
just, there was the gentleman over there, Andy, which we still owe a response to.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. You asked about the toxicity, etc., etc. Again, let me, if I may, first point is, anything that goes into the ground has to be deemed to be non-hazardous in accordance with the Environment Agency, and so that all gets approved. So anything that we pump down there gets classified in that thing. Simon's right. When you pump something down, we will not get all of what we pump down out of the ground. Typically, in the first 6 months to a year, you'll get about something in the order of somewhere between 30 and 50% of it back, and then over the rest of the life of the well, it'll take you up to about 80%. But about 20% will remain in the ground forever, because what it does is it attaches itself to the rock. In terms of what comes back out, Simon's also right in up to a point, in the sense of the most common thing is something called naturally occurring radioactive material. It comes back up with the water. This is any rock has naturally occurring radioactivity associated with it. You know, if those of you who've been down to Cornwall will be aware there it tends to be much higher levels. Right. Those of you in Granite City in Aberdeen, the same thing. The granite there has naturally occurring radioactivity. We measure this. We have to dispose of it through licensed waste facilities under various permits. So we're aware of that, and that's part of what the industry is looking to build a broader supply chain to support that. But let me put a little bit of this into some perspective for you again to show how well regulated we are. And again, I'm going to be very careful about what I say here for reasons that will become apparent. When we flow that water back, any produced water that comes out of the ground will have this naturally occurring radioactive material. We measure that. If it goes above 1 becquerel per litre, we have to have a permit to handle it and dispose of it. Now then, to put that into some perspective, and I'm going to do something in a moment, but I don't want you to take any notice of the label on this. You can go into the supermarket and buy this sort of thing off the shelf, and it will have a higher level of radioactivity associated with it than we have to have permits to manage. So you're allowed to drink it, but we're not allowed to dispose of it without permits. Just to put it into some perspective, and what I'm talking about, and I'm not saying this particular make because I don't want to be sued by them, but it's, remember the key word on this is mineral water. It comes out of the ground. It has naturally occurring radioactive material in it. And we've measured this because of this very argument that we get accused, oh, you're producing radioactive material. And we've measured and gone to and taken several bottles of different makes, and that's why I don't want to talk about specific ones, and they go up to 3 to 4 becquerels per litre. So we're allowed to drink it, but we're not allowed to dispose of it without permitting.
Okay, I think we need to move on to the next question. Now, the truth is we've drifted onto this subject anyway, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to lump a couple of questions together. So there was one that Josephine was going to ask.
What would you say to the argument that we shouldn't be investing in another fossil fuel and researching and exploring another possible renewable energy source?
Instead. Okay, so that's definitely a point that we've already discovered, but there was a sort of an additional bit to that which Juljar Panasar was going to ask, which is along the same lines.
Well, the nature of fossil fuels are that, the nature of shale gas reserves are that they may run out within 50 years. At that time, the UK will revert to importing natural gas for domestic heating or artificially create natural gas, or aim to have alternative heating technologies in place. So what are the plans for the post-fracking period?
So I guess both of those questions are saying, I guess referring to the possibility that shale gas could be regarded as a distraction, and either we've got to do something else which is renewable or indeed plan for the long term. And I thought actually, given that the panel's really covered this point quite a lot, there was another point in the audience which was David Midgen. I wonder if you had a question, but equally I wonder if you would like to perhaps offer us your view on that. Can you?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I would. My question, several of the aspects of my question have, in a sense, already been answered. But I will read it out, and I want to comment on it on a couple of points as well. So given that the following 4 things are true, first of all, Nick Clegg has told us that fracking will not make a significant contribution to the UK's energy needs before 2024, about 10 years. So we're looking at that sort of time frame before any major impacts are going to occur. On current trends, secondly, by that date, more than half the world's energy will be being produced from renewable sources. That will be far cheaper than shale gas. So a lot of the discussion this evening has been based on the premise that shale gas is cheaper than renewables. Whilst that may be true at the moment, the cost curves for those two technologies are very different. Renewable energies, particularly solar and wind as well, are reducing in costs year on year. At the moment, solar energy is reducing by approximately 40% a year. Production is ramping up by about 70% a year in the case of solar, and I think 25 to 30% in the case of wind. Simon will be able to back me up on that. So what we are looking at, although at the moment renewables do not contribute a very significant share of world energy, within 10 years, because of those exponential rates of growth, which there's no particular reason to think will slow down before that time, we will be seeing a totally different picture. Now, we are now looking at major investment in a very polluting fossil fuel, which will not deliver any returns before that time. At that time, we have to think this is a dynamic situation, and I think a lot of the decisions are being taken on the way that things look at the moment. They will look very different in 10 years. So I agree with, I think that it's been shown from the discussion that the only way to address the energy gap, which is going to be coming in the next 2 or 3 years, the only practical way is the energy efficiency. But we need to be investing now in renewable energy technologies, which will have the potential to plug that gap in the future. Just one point on climate impacts also. Again, the assumption has been there that because we're talking about methane gas, or whatever the gas mix is, I think it's not pure methane, but it's the same as natural gas, say, from North Sea, that the climate impacts will be therefore the same, and they will be lower than coal and oil. A recent study, which I think is the first academic research directly comparing the carbon footprint of shale gas with coal and oil, has shown that because of the large amounts of methane that typically escape, the climate footprint of shale gas is worse than oil, and it is 20% worse than coal. So we are talking about a very polluting technology. When we talk about 50 years supply, we are talking about vastly exceeding the amount of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere without breaching the 2-degree climate limit. We cannot burn all that oil. So, or like gas, sorry. So I think, you know, the message that comes through, we really need to understand the consequences of continuing to burn fossil fuels and breaching that 2-degree barrier. Those are not being fully taken into account either economically or in terms of their human impact.
Okay, thank you. John, I wanted to ask you to respond to that, but I want to restrict you to one aspect of it, if that's okay, because I wanted some facts which I don't know. I mean, is it correct to say that even if we decided, no, yeah, we're going to do fracking in the Bolan Basin, let's do it, is 2024 a reasonable estimate for when we'd actually start to get electricity out of shale gas? Is that, in your experience, does that make sense?
If I may, I'll answer that one. No, I think we'll get there quicker. But we're not, I agree entirely, we're not going to suddenly drop gas prices either. But the one I want to pick up on, if I may, because this is the one I think I'm best qualified to comment on, and I think the rest of the panel can address your other points, and they will address them very positively in your argument. It's this emission one. I think that's one of these fallacies. The thing you said that there's going to be large methane escaping, etc. Our whole business is predicated on capturing that methane. It's our revenue stream. The last thing we want to do is have that methane escaping. All those sorts of figures are predicated on the back of practice that goes on in the US, where there is large amounts of this flowback water in open pits. We have to put it into sealed tanks. We have to ensure that we capture it all. So I think that point is not going to be the case here in the UK.
Okay. John, I wondered, I mean, the point about, you know, it's a distraction, we need to think longer term. I imagine that's something you would probably agree with?
Yes. Yes, I would see, to meet lots of the targets, I would see a demand-based policy in the short term and a demand and supply-based solution in the long term. When you look at the marginal abatement cost curves, all of the demand side options sit very much on the revenue generating side for an economy, and so therefore that to me is the no-brainer options to start on, and that's how I would deal with the immediate crisis and the problem. Also, with that taken into account, you then obviously open up more options on the renewable side. I do acknowledge with the comment made earlier that there are lots of issues with renewables, and I do think we do potentially have not got all the answers. I totally agree with that, and I think there are major issues on storage and intermittency problems to overcome. So I'm not trying to pretend that renewables also gives us the complete answer to this, and we may even have to face some very difficult questions on nuclear, try and even overcome potentially the problems in the gap that may happen. So it's not an easy path, but I think it is a no-brainer to start on the demand side. Yeah.
Can I sort of come back on?
Yes, please.
I mean, Nick Clegg says it'll be 10 years or so. Well, despite the fact Nick Clegg says it probably is true. Diggs. I'm a politician. What can I do? I think one of the issues that we sort of miss, really, and we're talking about generating power, and we're looking at all these power stations, coal power stations, gas power stations. What about the heat? There's heat produced and lost in huge amounts in terms of these power stations. Why are we not capturing it? Why are we not using it? Why are we not making it to best effect in terms of energy efficiency? I think that's important. With shale gas, I think we're looking at shale gas, but we're talking about a wider energy vision here. And in many ways, shale gas is just a symptom of the problem. Yes, we can come out with issues about shale gas, and yes, we'll have some good advocacy for it and saying, well, actually, that's not the case. But really, the fact that shale gas is even being considered is because of a lack of vision in terms of energy, because there isn't anything going on in terms of addressing demand, because we are way at the bottom of the league with renewables. If we have a vision of a country where there are people, yes, in jobs, doing a lot of jobs which are interesting, skilled, which are part of a vision for the future which is low energy, low carbon energy, where we can say that we're part of the solution to climate change, not simply saying, well, we'll have a shale gas well in 100 years, which started onshore and became offshore. You know, we really need to have a vision for the future, and that, unfortunately, that doesn't need shale gas. It just doesn't need it.
Okay. I think, folks, we're running a little bit short on time, so I think we'll move on to the next question, which is a question from Tom Tranter.
Hi there. Seems like the debate has sort of been steering towards the climate change argument rather than about the details of fracking itself. But to bring it back to that, have the arguments against fracking been over-exaggerated by the media? For example, we've already touched on the number of onshore wells that are already in the UK, many in environmentally sensitive areas, and there's an argument, a local environment argument about the quantity of water used to frack a shale well. But that's actually broadly the same as the amount used to irrigate a golf course, but we don't really hear much protest about those. So I wonder if you could address the local environment issues there and whether they've been over-exaggerated.
So I think the question really is the media getting in the way, I suppose, in a way of us making rational decisions on this? I mean, Simon, what do you think?
I think we need to look at the evidence and risk, and that's why I'm really kind of keen to hear the results from Liam's department's work around the risk. I mean, certainly looking at the experience in the US, where you have had significant contributions, significant risk of contamination of groundwater from methane relating to the fracking industry. John will say but it's going to be magnificently different in the UK. I think the jury's still out on that in many respects. So there are risks attached to fracking. That there are risks attached to conventional gas production, but they're risks we don't have to take. They're risks we don't have to go down that road. We know we can generate from renewables. John mentioned the energy storage. Let's put that investment into researching energy storage. Let's crack that intermittency problem once and for all. It's not that far away in terms of overcoming those technological challenges. In terms of the water issue, yes, in order to feed one well, it's the equivalent of one golf course. But in a local area, in a river catchment area, you are going to have potentially multiple wells. And that's when the real kind of issues come into place. So in the River Wyre in Lancashire at the moment, they're having real concerns over the quantity of water that's coming in that's actually been abstracted from that particular catchment. Across, yeah, and the whole UK water demand is kind of fairly negligible, but in those local areas, those local circumstances, then the water supply problem is a major issue.
Andrew, one of your colleagues has been in a little bit of bother in the media over the fracking.
Yeah, good old Caroline, she'll be in court. I think, is it next week after? The point about, can the media over-exaggerate energy issues? Yes, of course they can, and of course the biggest example of that is wind. In terms of wind technology, and the media has played a large role in actually demonising wind technology and coming out with huge myths about it. And so the media is quite capable of misrepresenting energy and such issues. And in the case of wind, there's things like epileptic fits that people get as a result of watching it, golden eagles being decapitated, all sorts of things that go on in terms of wind technology. One of the positives, I think, about that is that in terms of fracking, is it's putting a lot of attention onto it, and we have debates like this one now, and so the aim has got to be is to get people to understand the issues. And if fracking has done one good thing, and I think the thing about Caroline Lucas actually getting arrested actually brought fracking into people's attention, and we started thinking about it in the context of all energy and our whole energy policy, and in terms of its role in climate change. And that has been the real benefit, if you like, of getting the media involved in terms of the fracking issue, because it gets the whole energy issue on the agenda, and that's crucially important for everybody.
Liam, I just wondered, as a researcher working in this industry, are you comfortable with the way the area that you work in is portrayed in the press? Is it?
I think, yeah. I mean, as the first fossil fuel of the internet age, the misinformation potential is great on both sides, and I think the sort of the pro side is often over exaggerated, and the risk side is over exaggerated, and of course the truth lies somewhere in between. I mean, shales are grey, and it is literally a grey area on a whole variety of reasons, and that's what we're trying to get clarification upon. I think one of the big issues has been in the US, because there was virtually no baseline data gathered. Fracking has just taken off in various regions without any clear sense of what the conditions were like prior to that, that then a lot of the claims that are made for and against it are difficult to absolutely prove in a sort of scientific way. I think in the UK, the fact it hasn't happened gives us a point to say, okay, we have a chance to say the baseline data and know what or at least begin to look at what the potential impacts are if it happens. I think talking about sort of the research into fracking, yes, I mean, clearly we need to look at energy more broadly, and I think the point you make about this bringing energy discussions to the fore is a really good one. From a sort of personal perspective, we are not just looking at researching fracking in the UK, we're looking at its impacts in Europe, because obviously various different contexts, and I think that's something we perhaps get a little bit too bogged down on and say it doesn't happen in the UK or it happens in a small way, but it could take off in a big way in other countries, and we still need to know what the impacts and the risks would be. I mean, certainly Poland and Ukraine are very keen to develop gas for their own supplies to be less dependent on Russia. We can see it's been problematic in recent weeks for one reason or another. My other final point really would just be that absolutely renewables are the way to go. There's no question on that. But we seem to overlook the fact that we have to build them, and to build them we need geological resources, and that involves mining. So whilst I'm not going against it, I think we have to factor. There's a very interesting paper last year looking at this, various trajectories for different plans for what renewables could deliver. And then the raw material demand is enormous for various different things. And that's something we have to consider very carefully, because we allow mining, Britain is not really a mining country any longer, so we import things without really thinking about where they've come from. And I think that's an absolutely key thing that again, I'm biased, I think about these things geologically, but we seem to forget that we have to get the materials to construct whatever we choose to go with. And the resources they have an impact as well. Now, maybe not an impact on us, and we see shale gas in the UK and have our problems sort of with its local impact, its environmental impact. We perhaps don't think about what the bigger picture is of whatever choice we make, dependent on what resources then required. So I don't have answers. That's why we're going to be carrying out research into fracking particularly, but I think more broadly there's a lot of clarity required about exactly what geological resources are required for a whole variety of different energy sources.
Okay, thank you. Folks, we are running out of time, unfortunately, so again, in the best editions of question time, I've got one last question, and you basically get a sentence each to answer it, and then we're going to have to draw it to a close, and it's my question. So the question is, who stands to benefit most from shale gas, and are the government offering enough to communities like the ones in Yorkshire and Lancashire? I throw in Lancashire because, of course, that's my part of the world. Where are the government offering enough for communities in Yorkshire and Lancashire where fracking will take place, or fobbing them off with small change, spending the proceeds elsewhere? I appreciate this is not a question that everybody will have a great deal of insight in, but tell you what, let's start at this end and go that way. Short answers, please.
Well, I think really it's difficult to know at the moment because the US case is not relevant to us in most regards because people have their own mineral rights to the land that is being drilled. We don't have that. The only person other than the Queen who has their own oil and gas rights is the Duke of Devonshire because the drilling near Chatsworth took place before the regulation came in place. So in terms of benefits for individuals, it's not really clear at the minute.
Okay, so it's the landed gentry that are going to get all the proceeds?
Well, perhaps.
So.
I think the companies like John's will do very well out of fracking. The rest of society probably won't. And you can see across from Balcombe to Barton Moss to places like Daneshill in North Nottinghamshire that companies are feeling beset by fracking companies, and they are voting with their feet.
Okay, John.
I'll just use the opportunity to say I always find it bizarre when you have a carbon floor tax and then you offer a tax break to a high carbon energy source, and just the irony of that is quite clear. So I haven't answered your question at all, but I had it on my list of which to say it.
Fair enough, I can't argue with that. Andrew?
I also don't want to answer your question, and the way I'm not going to answer it is by saying, imagine if we started off the wind industry in the UK by offering benefits to individuals and offering benefits to communities in terms of their energy bills and all those sort of things. Imagine if we'd have started off like that. People will be saying, when am I going to get a wind turbine in this area? Because they've had a wind turbine and their energy bills have reduced, there's been money going into the community, the things been happening. So we're starting the shale gas industry in this place, the place where we should have started the wind industry. And if we'd have done that, we'd be in a much different place now. We'd have different attitudes about wind technology, I'm quite sure.
Okay, thank you. And John, are you going to make the people of Yorkshire rich?
I've been asked that question once before, and there's always, wherever there's mud, there's brass, yes, in Yorkshire. Couple of points. First of all, the model that's been proposed has been developed primarily because there is an acknowledgement and a recognition that the communities that have drilling going on in their midst are going to be subject to some level of, it's like any industry that comes along, it's going to have an impact. So the idea behind that was to try to ensure that those communities who are being affected to some extent benefit from it directly, not just by all the revenues going to the exchequer and then potentially getting distributed somewhere else. It's to make sure that they got some. And Andy's being a little bit, perhaps, the wind industry does the same thing with communities in which it is. They get the people around the wind turbines get a percentage of how much electricity is generated.
No, that's
the nuclear industry also did the same thing. So this is not something new. It is a model that has been applied. The question was, is it bribing? That one, I have to say, as an industry, we struggle a bit because it comes across like that, but the intent is meant to be a positive one.
Okay. It's not true about wind.
Okay. Well, how this was developed, using the wind example.
But in the case of wind, it is done on a voluntary. It's a voluntary basis.
It, yeah.
It's a voluntary basis. It is not statutory that they've got to do it.
Yeah.
With you, it's going to be part of the regime
as well.
It's not the same with wind.
Gentlemen. Unfortunately, folks, we've run out of time. Before we finish, I think the President of the Energy Society wanted to say a few words. But while Tom is making his way up here, can we thank the panel for a wide-ranging and excellent discussion. And then just to close, folks, this is Tom Chant, who is the President of the Student Energy Society.
Hi, and thank you, everyone, for coming. Just before we finish the questioning, I'm going to hijack the last bit to ask you one-word answers. Will we have shale gas in a meaningful sense in Britain?
One word?
Yes, I think.
Yes, yes.
I hope not.
No.
It's highly uncertain.
Oh, maybe.
No.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, can we?
No, you can't qualify it now.
Hands up for yes.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, in the audience, who thinks we should have shale gas? Yes.
We should. I thought we were saying would we? I think it's we.
No. You think the no's just about get it?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming. And as Andy said, this has been organised by the Energy Leeds Society. If any of you are students here, it's a free society to join. We aim to have interesting discussions and evening talks at least once a month. And we'll also be organising things like trips to De Norwich Power Station in the near future. And yeah, thank you to all the panel. And thank you to all the Energy Leeds exec for helping organise this.
Thank you very much. And that's your lot, folks. Have a safe journey home.